Richard Bong, From Airacobra to Lightning, America's Greatest Ace, Part 1, The Farm Boy Who Would Rule the Skies. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon over Poplar, Wisconsin, when young Dick Bong climbed down from the hayloft of his family's barn. It was 1928, and the 9-year-old had spent another night reading by candlelight about the Great War aces, Rickenbacker, Luke, Lufberry. His father, Carl Bong, a Swedish immigrant farmer, had no idea that his son's fascination with those distant dogfights would one day make the Bong name legendary. Richard Ira Bong grew up in the kind of rural America where hard work wasn't a virtue, it was survival. The farm demanded everything from the family, and Dick learned early that mastery came through repetition and attention to detail. Whether it was milking cows at dawn or repairing farm equipment, his father insisted on doing things right the first time. This philosophy would later translate into the cockpit, where precision meant the difference between life and death. But young Bong's mind wasn't on farming. While his hands worked the soil, his eyes tracked every airplane that passed overhead, rare sightings that sent his imagination soaring. He built model aircraft from scraps of wood, his fingers carefully shaping wings and fuselages. His mother, Dora, recognized something in her son's distant gaze, that look toward the horizon that no amount of farm work could suppress. By 1938, Bong had enrolled at Superior State Teachers College. At 20, he should have been thinking about a career in education, but his real education came from the civilian pilot training program. The moment he climbed into a cockpit for the first time, a simple trainer aircraft, everything clicked. The stick felt natural in his hand, the rudder pedals responsive under his feet. His instructor noted that Bong had an unusual gift, exceptional eyesight combined with an almost preternatural ability to judge distances and angles in three-dimensional space. When Bong enlisted in the Army Air Corps in May 1941, America wasn't yet at war, but everyone knew it was coming. He reported to flight training with the same methodical determination he'd applied to farm chores. At Luke Field in Arizona, then Gardner Field in California, instructors watched him progress with unusual speed. He wasn't flashy or cocky like some cadets. He was quiet, analytical, almost scientific in his approach to flying. Part 2. The Airacobra Years. Bong received his wings and commission as a second lieutenant in January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor plunged America into war. The military was desperate for pilots, particularly fighter pilots who could challenge Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Bong's first operational assignment sent him to Hamilton Field in California, where he would fly the P-39 Airacobra. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was an unusual aircraft to say the least. Its Allison engine was mounted behind the cockpit, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This mid-engine design gave the plane distinctive handling characteristics and a controversial reputation. At high altitudes, the P-39 was outclassed by most enemy fighters. Its turbo supercharger had been removed to save weight, crippling its high-altitude performance. But at low to medium altitudes, it was nimble and packed serious firepower. A 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, along with machine guns in the nose and wings. For Bong, learning the Airacobra's quirks was just another problem to solve. He spent hours in the cockpit, memorizing every instrument, every switch, every characteristic of the aircraft's behavior. Other pilots complained about the plane's tendency to tumble during certain maneuvers, or its relatively slow rate of climb. Bong simply adapted his flying to work with the aircraft's strengths, rather than against its weaknesses. His commanding officers quickly noticed something about the quiet Wisconsin farm boy. During training exercises, Bong demonstrated an uncanny ability to position himself advantageously. While other pilots might dive headlong into a mock dogfight, Bong would climb to gain altitude, use the sun to mask his approach, and choose his moment with patience that belied his youth. He understood something fundamental that many aggressive young pilots missed. Air combat wasn't about courage or daring. It was about geometry, energy management, and timing. In September 1942, Bong received orders that would change his life. Assignment to the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group in the Southwest Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were locked in a desperate struggle with the Japanese in New Guinea. The fighting was brutal, primitive, and absolutely crucial to the Allied strategy of island hopping toward Japan. When Bong arrived at Port Moresby, New Guinea, the reality of combat aviation hit him immediately. This wasn't the glamorous aerial warfare he'd read about as a boy. Pilots lived in tents, battled dysentery and malaria, and flew missions over some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The jungle below was so dense that a forced landing meant almost certain death, either from the crash itself or from the impossible task of surviving in the wilderness. The airfield itself was crude, a strip of pierced steel planking laid over mud that turned into a quagmire every time it rained, which was often. Ground crews worked in the open, performing maintenance under conditions that would have shut down any stateside operation. Spare parts were scarce, and mechanics cannibalized wrecked aircraft to keep the operational ones flying. Bong flew his first combat mission in the P-39 on November 27, 1942. The squadron was tasked with escorting Douglas A-20 Havoc bombers on a strike against Japanese positions near Buna. As the formation droned north over the Owen Stanley Mountains, Bong's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Every pilot's first combat mission was a terrifying unknown. No amount of training could truly prepare you for someone trying to kill you. The Japanese fighters didn't appear that day. Bong returned to base with his guns unfired, but he'd crossed an important threshold. He'd flown into combat airspace and back. The next time would be easier. His first aerial victory came on December 27, 1942, exactly 1 month after that first mission. Bong was flying patrol over the Buna-Gona area when he spotted 2 Japanese fighters below. Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, nimble and dangerous. Everything slowed down for Bong in that moment. He checked his 6 o'clock. Clear. He calculated the enemy's speed and trajectory, then pushed the stick forward, diving to build energy. The P-39's engine roared as gravity accelerated the aircraft. Bong lined up the trailing Oscar in his gun sight, watching the range close. Not yet. Not yet. At 300 yards, he pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon thumped, and tracer rounds from the machine guns drew a line through the air toward the enemy fighter. Pieces flew off the Oscar's wing. The Japanese pilot tried to break away, but Bong stayed with him, firing again. The Oscar rolled over and plunged into the jungle below. Bong's hands were shaking when he landed back at Port Moresby. He'd killed a man, probably. The Oscar had gone down smoking, but he hadn't seen a parachute. That night, alone in his tent, he thought about the Japanese pilot. Did he have a family? Had he been a farm boy too, drafted into a war he didn't choose? But such thoughts were luxuries a combat pilot couldn't afford. The next morning, Bong climbed back into his P-39 and flew another mission. Part 3. The Lightning Calls. By early 1943, Bong had several victories to his name, but he was growing increasingly frustrated with the P-39's limitations. In combat against experienced Japanese pilots flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, the Airacobra's weaknesses became painfully apparent. The Zero could outclimb it, outturn it, and outlast it in sustained maneuvering combat. Bong developed tactics to compensate. He learned to use the P-39's diving speed and firepower to make slashing attacks, hitting hard and breaking away before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could bring their guns to bear. Hit and run, dive and zoom. Never, ever get into a turning fight with a Zero. But he knew there had to be a better tool for the job. And that tool was arriving in the Southwest Pacific, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike anything else in the sky. A twin-engine, twin-boom design with a central nacelle housing the cockpit, it looked like something from a science fiction magazine. 2 Allison V1710 engines, each driving a 3-bladed propeller, gave the Lightning phenomenal speed and a climb rate that could challenge any Japanese fighter. Its twin booms extended back from the engines to a horizontal stabilizer that connected them, with twin vertical stabilizers on each end. The Lightning's armament was concentrated in the nose: 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead with no convergence issues. This meant the guns were effective at much greater ranges than wing-mounted guns, which were typically bore-sighted to converge at a specific distance. A skilled pilot could hit targets at 1,000 yards with the Lightning's nose guns. But the P-38's greatest advantage might have been its range. With drop tanks, it could stay airborne for hours, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory or flying long patrol missions over vast stretches of ocean. This extended range was crucial in the Pacific, where distances between bases could span hundreds of miles of open water. Bong first laid eyes on the P-38 in March 1943, when a squadron of Lightnings arrived at Port Moresby. He watched them approach for landing, their distinctive silhouette unmistakable against the tropical sky. As they touched down, the whine of their twin turbo-superchargers sang a different song than the throaty roar of the P-39's single engine. He immediately requested a transfer to a P-38 unit. His squadron commander, recognizing Bong's growing skill and potential, approved the request. In April 1943, Richard Bong officially transitioned to the P-38 Lightning, joining the 9th Fighter Squadron's P-38 flight. The transition training revealed both the Lightning's capabilities and its quirks. The aircraft demanded respect. With 2 engines, a pilot faced new challenges. What if one engine failed? The P-38 could fly on one engine, but it required immediate and correct control inputs to prevent a deadly roll. The engines rotated in opposite directions to counter torque effects, but this meant the pilot had to understand asymmetric thrust and how to manage it. Bong approached the Lightning with his characteristic methodical nature. He studied the pilot's manual like it was scripture. He spent hours in the cockpit while the aircraft sat on the ground, practicing emergency procedures until they became muscle memory. He talked to experienced P-38 pilots, learning their hard-won lessons. And he flew, every chance he got, learning the Lightning's personality. The P-38's cockpit was more spacious than the cramped confines of the P-39. The controls were well laid out, though pilots joked about needing 3 hands to manage everything during combat: stick, throttles, trim wheels, mixture controls, propeller pitch levers, and gun trigger. The visibility was excellent, with the cockpit positioned high in the central nacelle, giving the pilot an unobstructed view in almost every direction. During his first solo flight in the Lightning, Bong felt the difference immediately. The acceleration on takeoff was exhilarating. 2 engines producing 2,800 horsepower combined, pushing the aircraft down the runway with authority. As he rotated and climbed away from Port Moresby, the twin Allisons singing their turbo-supercharged song, he smiled for the first time in weeks. This was the airplane he'd been waiting for. At altitude, he experimented cautiously, feeling out the Lightning's characteristics. The rate of roll was slower than single-engine fighters. Those twin booms and engines created a lot of rotational inertia. But the Lightning could turn respectably, and its energy retention and vertical maneuvers was outstanding. Bong pulled back on the stick and pointed the nose skyward, watching the altimeter spin upward at a rate the P-39 could never match. He practiced gunnery, learning how the concentrated nose armament changed his shooting geometry. With wing-mounted guns, you had to consider convergence, the point where the bullets from each wing met. But the Lightning's guns all fired from the same point, in parallel. This meant a pilot could be accurate at much longer ranges, though it also required more precise aiming. There was no shotgun spread to compensate for small errors. Part 4. The Lightning Ace emerges. Bong flew his first combat mission in the P-38 on April 14, 1943, leading a flight on a bomber escort mission. The Lightnings cruised at high altitude, easily keeping pace with the B-17 flying fortresses they were protecting. When Japanese fighters appeared, a group of Zeros climbing to intercept the bombers, Bong rolled his Lightning over and dove to meet them. What happened next would become his signature tactic. Instead of getting into a sustained turning fight with the more maneuverable Zeros, Bong used the P-38's superior speed and climb rate to execute boom and zoom attacks. Dive in, fire, break away, and climb back to altitude using the Lightning's powerful engines. Don't turn with them, outrun them. In that first engagement, Bong damaged one Zero and watched another P-38 pilot finish it off. But he'd proved to himself that his tactics worked. The Lightning was a different kind of fighter, and it required a different kind of fighting. Over the next weeks and months, Bong refined his approach through constant combat. The skies over New Guinea became his laboratory. Almost every day brought new missions: bomber escorts, fighter sweeps, patrols over Allied positions. The Japanese were determined to hold New Guinea, seeing it as crucial to the defense of their empire. American forces were equally determined to take it, making it a stepping stone toward the Philippines and eventually Japan itself. Bong's victory tally began to climb steadily. On May 28, 1943, he shot down 2 Zeros in a single mission, bringing his total to 8 confirmed victories, making him an ace with triple confirmation. On June 12th, he downed another Zero. On July 26, 2 more fell to his guns during a furious dogfight over Leh. What made Bong so effective wasn't reckless aggression, but rather a combination of exceptional eyesight, patience, and tactical intelligence. Fellow pilots noticed that Bong always seemed to spot enemy aircraft before anyone else. His eyes constantly scanned the sky, using a systematic pattern that covered every sector. He understood that the pilot who saw his enemy first held an enormous advantage. Once he spotted enemy aircraft, Bong didn't immediately attack. He positioned himself carefully, considering altitude, sun position, cloud cover, and the relative energy states of all the aircraft involved. He waited for the right moment when his target was distracted, low on energy, or positioned where a quick attack and escape was possible. And his shooting was phenomenally accurate. Bong had learned on the farm that you didn't waste ammunition. Every shell counted. This translated into a pilot who fired short, precise bursts rather than hosing bullets wildly at targets. He typically fired from closer ranges than many pilots, waiting until he was sure of a hit before pressing the trigger. His gun camera footage showed time and again that when Bong fired, he hit. By August 1943, Bong had 15 confirmed victories. He was promoted to captain and began receiving attention in the American press. Newspapers back home ran stories about the Wisconsin farm boy who was terrorizing Japanese pilots. His hometown of Poplar organized a celebration, though Bong was thousands of miles away, still flying missions over New Guinea. But the attention made him uncomfortable. Bong was a private person, almost shy in social situations. He wrote letters home to his parents and to his girlfriend, Marjorie Vattendahl, a girl from Superior, Wisconsin, whom he'd met before the war. He told them about the flying, the beauty of the sunrise at 25,000 feet, the satisfaction of a well-executed mission. But he never bragged about his victories. Killing enemy pilots wasn't something to celebrate. It was a job that needed doing. His squadron mates noticed that Bong never claimed a victory unless he was absolutely certain. Some pilots might see an enemy aircraft smoking and assume it crashed. Bong wanted to see it hit the ground or the water. Some might claim a victory based on gun camera footage showing hits. Bong wanted confirmation from other pilots or ground observers. This conservative approach meant that his actual number of aircraft destroyed was probably higher than his confirmed total. Part 5. The System of Success. By late 1943, Bong had developed a systematic approach to air combat that made him arguably the most effective fighter pilot in the Pacific theater. His method combined elements of careful preparation, tactical positioning, and ruthless execution. Before every mission, Bong studied the intelligence reports carefully. Where were the Japanese known to operate? What types of aircraft had been spotted recently? What were the weather conditions at various altitudes? What was the sun's position at different times during the mission? He treated each sortie like a farm problem to be solved. Gather information, make a plan, execute methodically. During the mission, Bong's eyes never stopped moving. He developed a scanning pattern that covered the entire sky in sectors, pausing momentarily on each sector before moving to the next. He paid particular attention to the area above and behind, the high 6 o'clock, where Japanese fighters often lurked, waiting to dive on unwary Americans. When he spotted enemy aircraft, Bong's next step was always the same: get higher. Altitude was life in air combat. The pilot with superior altitude could choose when and how to engage. He could dive to build speed, attack, and then use that speed to climb back to safety. The pilot caught low had to accept whatever fight was forced upon him. Bong would climb above his target, positioning himself between the enemy and the sun when possible. The sun was a fighter pilot's friend and enemy. It could hide you from the enemy, but it could also blind you if you looked toward it. Bong used it as camouflage, making his approach with the sun at his back, knowing the enemy would have trouble spotting him against the glare. His attack runs were clinical. Bong would roll inverted and pull through into a steep dive, building speed rapidly. The Lightning could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour in a dive, much faster than most Japanese fighters could manage. He'd line up his target, close to within 300 yards, sometimes as close as 100 yards, and fire a short, precise burst. The P-38's concentrated firepower was devastating at these ranges. The 450 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. Japanese fighters of the era were notoriously fragile, built for maneuverability and range rather than survivability. They lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection. When Bong's guns found their mark, the results were usually catastrophic for the enemy. After firing, Bong didn't stick around to admire his work. He'd push the throttles forward and extend away from the fight, using the P-38's superior speed to escape. If enemy fighters tried to follow, they'd quickly fall behind as the Lightning's powerful engines pulled it away. Then Bong would zoom climb back to altitude, converting his speed back into height, and position himself for another attack if opportunities presented themselves. This approach, later called boom and zoom or energy tactics, was being independently discovered by successful fighter pilots in all theaters of the war. German pilots on the Eastern Front, RAF pilots over Europe, and American pilots in the Pacific were all learning the same lessons. But few applied the method as consistently and effectively as Richard Bong. His squadron mates tried to learn from him. During debriefings, Bong would patiently explain what he'd seen and done, drawing diagrams to illustrate his positions and maneuvers. He was generous with his knowledge, never hoarding techniques that might save someone else's life. Some pilots could adapt his methods. Others, more aggressive by temperament, struggled with Bong's patient, calculating approach. By December 1943, Bong had 21 confirmed victories, making him one of the leading American aces in any theater. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, recognized that Bong was a valuable asset, not just as a combat pilot, but as a teacher. Kenney ordered Bong to spend time training new pilots arriving in the theater, passing on his hard-won tactical knowledge. But Bong chafed at being pulled from combat. He was a fighter pilot, not an instructor. He wanted to be where the action was, engaging the enemy, protecting his fellow pilots and the bombers they escorted. Kenney compromised, allowing Bong to continue flying missions while also spending time with replacement pilots, showing them the ropes. The young pilots who met Major Bong, he'd been promoted again, were sometimes surprised by his appearance. He wasn't the swaggering, larger-than-life fighter ace they might have imagined. He was soft-spoken, almost modest, with an earnest Midwestern manner that reminded many of them of neighbors or relatives back home. But when he climbed into a P-38 and took them up for training flights, they quickly understood why he was so successful. Bong would demonstrate his scanning technique, calling out aircraft positions using clock notation. Bogey at 2 o'clock high, approximately 3 miles. The trainees would squint against the sun, searching, and finally spot the tiny speck Bong had identified. How did he see things so far away? Practice, he'd tell them. Practice and knowing what to look for. He'd show them how to position for an attack, how to calculate deflection for a target in a turn, how to lead a fast-moving aircraft so your bullets and the enemy plane arrived at the same point in space at the same time. He'd demonstrate the correct dive angle for a slashing attack, how to manage your energy state, when to break off and run versus when to press an advantage. Don't be a hero, he'd tell them. Heroes end up dead. Be smart, be patient, and live to fly another mission. Part 6. The Race to the Top. As 1944 dawned, the war in the Pacific was entering a new phase. American forces were pushing north through New Guinea, preparing for the eventual liberation of the Philippines. The Japanese, desperate to slow the American advance, threw more and more aircraft into the battle. This meant more targets for pilots like Bong, but it also meant more danger. Other American aces were racking up impressive scores. Tommy McGuire, flying with the 475th Fighter Group, was particularly successful, and a friendly rivalry developed between him and Bong. Both were aggressive, skilled pilots flying P-38s. Both had similar tactical approaches, and both were climbing toward the record for American aces, Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 victories from World War I. The rivalry was good-natured, at least on Bong's part. He respected McGuire as a pilot, and wasn't particularly concerned with being the top ace. But the press seized on the competition, running stories about the race for the ace title. Families back home followed the tallies like sports scores. Bong's hometown paper, the Superior Evening Telegram, updated its readers on every new victory. In January 1944, Bong was sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. He hated every minute of it. Standing on stages, giving speeches to crowds, smiling for photographers, it all felt false to him. He was a pilot, not a celebrity. But the military needed heroes to sell war bonds and maintain civilian morale. So Bong did his duty, uncomfortable though it was. During the tour, he visited Marjorie in Superior. They'd been corresponding throughout his deployment, and their relationship had deepened despite the distance. In February, shortly before he was scheduled to return to the Pacific, Bong proposed. Marjorie accepted. They planned to marry after the war ended. Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific in March 1944, assigned to fly missions while also serving as an advanced gunnery instructor. Essentially, a roving teacher who could share his combat expertise across different squadrons. This arrangement satisfied both Bong's desire to keep fighting and Kenny's recognition that Bong's knowledge was too valuable to waste. His victory tally continued to climb. On March 3, 1944, he downed 2 aircraft in a single mission during a major air battle over Taji. On April 12th, another 2 fell to his guns during an escort mission. Each victory was recorded, confirmed, and added to his official total. By April 1944, Bong had surpassed Rickenbacker's 26 victories. He was now the highest-scoring American ace of all time. The news made headlines across America. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent a congratulatory telegram. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented Bong with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, in a ceremony at MacArthur's headquarters. The medal citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty, he has reflected great credit on himself and the armed forces of the United States." But Bong was more uncomfortable than proud. He didn't feel like a hero. He was just doing his job, and doing it the way his father had taught him to approach any task, with careful attention and determined effort. The Japanese pilots he'd shot down had been doing their jobs too. War wasn't heroic. It was simply necessary. Tommy McGuire, meanwhile, had 24 victories by mid-1944 and was pushing hard to catch up. The 2 men occasionally flew together, and there was genuine mutual respect between them. McGuire was more aggressive, more willing to take risks for a victory. Bong was more conservative, more calculating. Different approaches, both effective. Part 7. The Lightning's Limits. As Bong continued flying combat missions through the summer and fall of 1944, he was accumulating not just victories, but also a deep understanding of both the P-38 Lightning and the Japanese aircraft he fought against. The Lightning remained his favorite aircraft, but he'd learned its limitations. The Allison engines, while powerful, had a troubling tendency to fail under certain conditions. The turbo superchargers, while giving the Lightning its high-altitude performance, were complex and temperamental. Bong had experienced engine failures on several occasions and had become expert at bringing a crippled Lightning home on one engine, or dead-sticking it to a landing with both engines out. He'd also learned that while the P-38 could outturn Japanese fighters like the Zero, it couldn't match their incredible maneuverability at slow speeds. If you let your airspeed bleed off in a turning fight, you were in trouble. The key was to maintain energy. Keep your speed up, use your altitude, never get slow. The Japanese had introduced new aircraft types as the war progressed. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony was faster and more heavily armed than earlier Japanese fighters. The Nakajima Ki-84 Frank was genuinely formidable, with performance comparable to the best American fighters. These newer types couldn't be taken lightly. But the biggest change Bong noticed was in the Japanese pilots themselves. The veteran pilots he'd fought in 1942 and 1943, the men who'd trained before the war and fought in China and Southeast Asia, were mostly gone now, shot down or reassigned. The replacement pilots were younger, less experienced, less skilled. They made mistakes that veteran pilots wouldn't make. They fell for feints that earlier opponents would have recognized. They broke formation under pressure. This didn't make Bong's job easier, exactly. Desperate, poorly trained pilots could be unpredictable, and an inexperienced pilot could kill you just as dead as a veteran. But it did mean that the tactical situation had shifted. In 1942, the Japanese had held air superiority. By late 1944, American pilots controlled the skies, and Japanese aircraft were increasingly vulnerable. Bong's 36th victory came on October 10, 1944, during a mission over Balikpapan. He was escorting B-24 Liberators on a strike against oil facilities when Japanese fighters appeared. Bong dove on a formation of Oscars, fired a burst into the leader, and watched it spiral down, trailing smoke. It was routine by now, almost mechanical. Spot, position, attack, confirm, break away. But something had changed for Bong. The thrill of aerial combat, which had excited him as a young pilot, had faded. Now it was just work. Difficult, dangerous work that needed doing. He felt tired, worn down by 2 years of almost continuous combat operations. He'd lost friends, seen men die in burning aircraft or disappear over the jungle, never to be seen again. The constant stress of combat, the adrenaline spikes followed by exhaustion, the knowledge that any mission might be your last, it all accumulated like a weight on his shoulders. General Kenny noticed. In November 1944, he called Bong to his headquarters. "Dick," Kenny said, "you've done more than anyone could ask. 40 victories, the Medal of Honor. You've trained dozens of pilots and probably saved hundreds of lives with your tactics. I'm sending you home." Bong protested. He wanted to reach 40 victories, a nice round number. Kenny agreed to let him fly until he hit 40, then that was it. No more combat missions. Bong reached his 40th victory on December 17, 1944. The mission was over Mindoro in the Philippines. Bong spotted a Japanese fighter, probably an Oscar, below his formation. He rolled into his standard attack, dove, fired, and watched the enemy aircraft fall away in flames. It was his 200th combat mission and his final aerial victory. True to his word, General Kenny grounded Bong and sent him home to America. There would be no 41st victory, no continued race with Tommy Maguire, who now had 38 victories and was still flying combat. Bong's war was over. Part 8. The Lightning's Legacy. Richard Bong arrived back in the United States in January 1945 to a hero's welcome he didn't want and attention he couldn't escape. He was America's ace of aces, the deadliest fighter pilot the nation had ever produced. Newspapers wanted interviews, cities wanted to honor him, the military wanted him for public relations. On February 10, 1945, Bong married Marjorie Vattendahl in a ceremony in Superior, Wisconsin. The wedding made national news. For a brief moment, Bong could pretend he was just a regular guy marrying the girl he loved. But the reporters and photographers made that impossible. The Army Air Forces assigned Bong to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, as a test pilot. It seemed like a safe assignment, a chance to use his expertise without the dangers of combat. Bong would test new aircraft, evaluate their characteristics, and provide feedback to engineers and designers. One of the aircraft he tested was the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. The P-80 was revolutionary. No propeller, just pure jet thrust, pushing it through the sky at speeds that seemed impossible. Bong was fascinated by the new technology. This was the future of aviation, the next step beyond the P-38 Lightning that had served him so well. On August 6, 1945, Bong took off from Burbank, California in P-80A number 4485048 on an acceptance test flight. Moments after takeoff, while still at low altitude, the primary fuel pump failed. The engine lost power. Bong tried to restart it, but there wasn't enough time. He was too low to bail out safely. The P-80 crashed in a field near the airfield. Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. He'd been married for less than 6 months. The date was August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. News of Bong's death stunned the nation. How could someone who'd survived 200 combat missions, who'd fought the Japanese for 2 years over some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, die in a routine test flight? The irony was bitter and cruel. General George Kenney wrote, "Dick Bong was an outstanding fighter pilot and magnificent young man. His modesty and courage commanded the respect of all of us in the Air Force." Tommy McGuire never did surpass Bong's record. McGuire was killed in action in January 1945 with 38 victories, still chasing his friendly rival. McGuire died trying to protect another pilot, violating his own tactical principles in an act of bravery that cost him his life. The P-38 Lightning continued to serve through the end of World War II, but its role gradually diminished as newer aircraft entered service. After the war, the Lightning was quickly retired from frontline service, replaced by jets like the P-80 that had killed Bong. Today, only a handful of airworthy P-38s remain, cherished by collectors and aviation enthusiasts who appreciate the aircraft's unique design and historical significance. Part 9. Understanding the Legend. Looking back at Richard Bong's career, what made him so successful? It wasn't supernatural ability or reckless courage. It was a combination of factors that came together in one person at the right time and place. First, his eyesight was exceptional. Multiple sources confirm that Bong could spot enemy aircraft at ranges that surprised his squadron mates. In air combat, seeing the enemy first provided an enormous tactical advantage. Second, his temperament was perfectly suited to fighter combat. He wasn't impulsive or aggressive. He was patient, analytical, and methodical, traits he'd learned on his family's farm. He thought of air combat as a problem to be solved rather than a test of courage. Third, he had the right aircraft for the Pacific theater. The P-38 Lightning's range, firepower, and high-altitude performance were ideally suited to the vast distances and operational requirements of the Pacific War. Bong learned to exploit every advantage the Lightning offered while working around its limitations. Fourth, He was in the right place at the right time. The Southwest Pacific in 1942 to 1944 offered constant combat opportunities. Japanese and American forces were locked in a struggle that put hundreds of aircraft in the sky almost daily. A pilot with Bong's skills had ample opportunities to engage enemy aircraft. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, he survived. Many pilots with comparable skill died before they could accumulate high victory totals. Bong's conservative tactics, his attention to mechanical details, his careful mission planning, all of these helped ensure he came home from each mission. An ace who dies after 10 victories is tragic. An ace who survives for 40 victories becomes legendary. But Bong's legacy extends beyond his personal victory tally. The tactics he developed and taught influenced a generation of American fighter pilots. His systematic approach to air combat, careful preparation, advantageous positioning, precise execution, and immediate disengagement became standard doctrine. His emphasis on energy tactics, of trading speed and altitude while avoiding sustained turning fights, was adopted across the Air Force. The pilots he trained carried his lessons to their own squadrons. Some of those pilots trained others, and those others trained still more. Like ripples spreading across water, Bong's tactical wisdom spread through the American fighter community, influencing how fighter pilots thought about and executed their missions. Part 10. The Lightning and the Ace. The P-38 Lightning and Richard Bong are forever linked in aviation history. Neither would have achieved their legendary status without the other. The Lightning gave Bong the tool he needed to apply his tactical genius. Bong gave the Lightning a skilled advocate who demonstrated its capabilities when used correctly. The transition from the P-39 Airacobra to the P-38 Lightning was the turning point in Bong's combat career. The Airacobra had taught him the fundamentals and forced him to develop tactics that compensated for its limitations. But the Lightning allowed him to fully implement those tactics without the Airacobra's constraints. With the Lightning's speed, he could attack and break away before enemy fighters could react. With its climb rate, he could regain altitude quickly after each attack. With its range, he could escort bombers deep into enemy territory or patrol for hours waiting for targets. With its concentrated nose armament, he could hit targets at longer ranges with greater accuracy. Other pilots flew the P-38 with great success. Tommy McGuire accumulated 38 victories in the Lightning. Charles McDonald scored 27 victories. Thomas Lynch scored 20 victories before being killed in action. But none achieved what Bong did with the aircraft. This raises an interesting question. Was Bong the greatest American fighter ace because he was the most skilled pilot, or simply because he survived the longest? The question has no definitive answer. What we can say with certainty is that Bong combined exceptional natural abilities with learned skills, applied them systematically over 200 combat missions, and survived to become America's highest-scoring ace. The Lightning itself remained controversial throughout its service life. Some pilots loved it, others hated it. Those who took the time to learn its quirks and capabilities, who understood its strengths and weaknesses, who flew it the way it was designed to be flown, those pilots generally praised the aircraft. Those who tried to dogfight with it, who ignored its operating limitations, who flew it carelessly, those pilots often had bad experiences. Bong understood the Lightning. He respected it as a complex machine that demanded skill and attention. He never pushed it beyond its limits. He never tried to make it do things it wasn't designed to do. And in return, the Lightning carried him through 2 years of combat and 200 missions, bringing him home safely each time until his final mission was complete. Epilogue. Remembering the Ace. Richard Bong's name lives on in various ways. Bong State Recreation Area in Wisconsin preserves his memory. The USAF Thunderbirds aerial demonstration team has honored him by naming their P-38 demonstration aircraft Richard Bong. Aviation museums display artifacts from his career. His Medal of Honor citation is read by military cadets studying the warrior ethos. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the one that doesn't exist. The hundreds or thousands of lives saved by the tactics he developed and taught. The pilots who learned from Bong, who applied his lessons about careful preparation and systematic execution, who came home alive because they remembered what the ace from Wisconsin had told them. They are his true legacy. In Poplar, Wisconsin, the farm where Dick Bong grew up still stands, though the family no longer owns it. The barn where he dreamed of flying is still there. The fields where he worked are still cultivated. It's a reminder that heroes don't always come from extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes they come from ordinary places, from regular families, from quiet corners of America where hard work and attention to detail are simply the way things are done. Richard Ira Bong was a farm boy who became the greatest American fighter ace in history. He flew the P-38 Lightning with unmatched skill, combining natural ability with learned expertise to achieve 40 confirmed aerial victories. He developed and taught tactics that saved countless lives. He served his country with courage, skill, and humility. And then, cruelly, he died testing the next generation of aircraft that would make the Lightning obsolete. His story reminds us that war is full of ironies and injustices. It reminds us that survival in combat is never guaranteed, no matter how skilled you are. It reminds us that the price of freedom is paid by young men and women who do their duty even when it costs them everything. The P-38 Lightning was an extraordinary aircraft that served America well in the darkest days of World War II. Richard Bong was an extraordinary pilot who exemplified the best qualities of the greatest generation. Together, they wrote a chapter in aviation history that will never be forgotten. The farm boy from Wisconsin, who mastered the twin-engine fighter and became America's ace of aces, that's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth honoring. And it's all true.